Welcome everyone to our what's second in our lecture series and what we also consider the keynote of this lecture series. Tonight, we continue our series of talks on our theme of sutures, which seeks to provoke our thinking and exploration of how our work in the built environment can heal and stitch together the places and infrastructure that brings together people and communities. Last week, we heard from Anna McCorvey and Scott Kratz about the 11th Street Bridge Park, a new public space in Washington, D.C. that is a literal connector of people and community. And as you remember Nathaniel mentioning, Laurie Olin, tonight's keynote speaker, was the landscape architecture team on that project. This design of public spaces in particular is a special art that requires perspective, experience, and insight. Among Jane Jacobs' most insightful observations about cities is that open spaces in urban contexts, streets, squares, and parks, require deep understanding of the way that they form space, create a sense of safety, facilitate benign or even better fortuitous interaction amongst strangers to be successful. She writes a chapter in particular on neighborhood parks to correct a misunderstanding that all open space is inherently virtuous. The city at the time of her writing was filled with failed parks and poorly conceived open spaces that were a drag and detrimental force on life in the neighborhood. She claims that, quote, in certain specifics of its behavior, every city park is a case study unto itself and defies generalizations. She writes that in the sense that she says there's no easy formula to talk about what makes a successful urban park. Through subsequent study, exemplified by the seminal studies by William White, Jan Gehl, and others, today we know more about the subtle features that are in play in a complex matrix that impact the success of open spaces. Tonight, we have the great opportunity to hear from another seminal thinker and designer of open spaces that continues to shed light on the nature of urban places and spaces. The importance of tonight's talk is in part due to the central impact of urban open space on our image of the city. In the 1970s, for example, Bryant Park was a testament to the decay of the city, a center for drug dealing and use and prostitution. The park was an encapsulation of the image of the city that was filled with crime and danger, perpetuated by the highly intentional application of zoning that made the neighborhood around Bryant Park a single-use commercial center with no residential and therefore little life at night. This park was better boarded up and left empty. And actually, the first time I walked past Bryant Park in the summer of 1989, it was boarded up and empty. Today, Bryant Park is the image of the rebound of the city. In my years working as a young architect near Bryant Park, the park was the center of the neighborhood, the destination at lunchtime, food and entertainment in the evening, recreation on a quiet Saturday with the kids. Bryant Park is one of the great case studies of remaking a space that shifts the image of the city profoundly and lets us see the elegance and joyful potential of urbanity. The lessons of Bryant Park start with the appreciation that design of open space must be developed around highly tangible, but also often subtle details that require acute attention. Insightful design can be the beginning of a recalibration of the image of the city we carry with us. Laurie Olin, our keynote speaker of this series, has spent decades working on the design of place, developing deep insights into the planning and detailing that grounds his work with elegance and civic power to inspire people and communities to reimagine the nature of the city. As a starting point, Laurie noted once that, quote, "We know that throughout history, people like to sit in the sun with their back to a wall, under a tree, looking out and watching other people." Laurie is a distinguished teacher and author and one of the most renowned landscape architects practicing today. I'm quoting liberally from his website. From vision to realization, he has guided many nationally important projects, including the Washington Monument Grounds here in Washington, and of course, also Bryant Park in New York City. His recent projects include the AIA awarding Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the Simon and Helen Director Park in Portland, Oregon. While projects like Bryant Park or also Battery Park City that Laurie also worked on are great gifts to the rejuvenation of a city, Olin's practice is explicit about the critical need to address longstanding societal failures of planning that have left many urban neighborhoods with continuing challenges that are compounded in particular with the intensification of climate change. The office's website notes that, quote, the social, environmental, and economic inequalities in our landscape will only intensify if we do nothing. Continuing the quote, we must act quickly with compassion and fortitude to support those communities suffering as a result of discriminatory policies. Olin is committed to design that brings value to all, not just the privileged, and which strengthens economically challenged communities, end quote. Laurie is currently professor of practice of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has taught for 40 years, and is former chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at Harvard University. Laurie is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and recipient of the 1998 Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is a recipient of the 2012 National Medal of Arts, the highest lifetime achievement awarded for artists and designers bestowed by the National Endowment of the Arts and the President of the United States. He also holds the 2011 American Society of Landscape Architects Medal, the Society's highest award for a landscape architect. Please help me welcome to the podium our keynote speaker of this series, Laurie Olin. Laurie, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Well, it was close to an obituary, but it's okay. Who doesn't like attention? All right. Well, good evening or afternoon, whichever you prefer, and thanks for inviting me to come here today. One of my recurring concerns, as you have just heard, is that of the purpose and attitudes towards something which we'll call real life, the civil expression and meaning. So the central purpose, I think, of landscape architecture is the planning and design of land and its features, including the positioning and the relationships of diverse elements. If you think of the earth, the water, the vegetation, roads, pavement, structures that include buildings for private and public purpose. And the familiar topics, of course, are parks, squares, piazzas, campuses, systems of public space, community infrastructure, reservations for conservation of natural areas and resources. And in doing this work, it's common to consider aspects of natural systems and the physical character, the soils, the geology, the hydrology, the climate, the topography, ecology of a place, as well as the cultural artifacts and the historic legacy of any given location. Those are the things that define what we refer to often as the genius loci. Well, in the course of developing plans and proposals for the development of redevelopment or the transformation of sites from one situation to another, we consider the nature of the proposed result, in addition to the issues of the ecological health and the aesthetic merit, broad topics that dealt with extensively in most academic institutions. We teach about landscape architecture. The design of public space raises, I believe, ethical questions regarding social purpose, use, and behavior that are often inadequately discussed or addressed in the discourse of either professional schools or practice. Civic space has been central to the evolution of urban communities, and like them, has taken different forms and has expressed and accommodated different needs and functions through time. While the vast majority of public space in nearly all communities is devoted to movement, to circulation and access, other spaces are devoted to public encounter, to gathering, to recreation and leisure. And these remain important and among the most cherished and the most contested. We no longer have cattle markets and public executions in the heart of our cities, but we still use them for civic events and public rituals, like the 1 million people who came out for the Eagles last Friday in Philadelphia, or for play, for socialization, relaxation, celebration, protest. And The majority of parks and squares, boulevards and civic spaces that we enjoy as a legacy of the 19th century planning and design, say in New York or London, Paris, Berlin, Washington, Chicago, Philadelphia, they're seen here at the beginning of the end of that era in these slides. And they're, for a large part, they're the direct result of social and economic changes that gave rise to a vast middle class for whom they were intended. And this was a development that also came with a democratization of art and of literature that extended well into the 20th century, developments that I'm going to consider against a background of thought and behavior that accompanied these changes. The question, what is real, has preoccupied people who care to stop and consider it for centuries. Any number of academics, critics, or philosophers today would answer, well, that depends upon the cultural and relativistic orientation of one's conceptual apparatus. You know, Isaiah Berlin has remarked that realism normally means the correct perception of the characteristics of events or facts or persons without the distortion produced by feelings like hope or fear or love or hate, or by a disposition to idealize or depreciate, or anything else that interferes with accurate observation or action that is founded upon it as a result of emotional pressure of some kind. Well, realism in the arts as an idea or a problem appears in the mid-19th century as a contrast and antagonist to the romanticism of various forms like you see here of historical eclectic revival styles in painting and writing from the previous century. Centered in France between 1840 and 1880, the aim of realism, according to Linda Nochlin, was truthful, objective, and impartial representation of the real world based upon the meticulous observation of contemporary life. Well, one must also remember that this, did this change? Oh, there we go. One must also remember that this took place in the aftermath of a number of transformative revolutions and events, beginning with two in England in the 17th century, one bloody and one bloodless, and then two more, one in America and another in France at the end of the 18th century, both quite violent, both setting in motion events similar yet different, and still playing out as social experiments. Well, I can't help thinking of Zhou Enlai's remark when asked about his thought about the French Revolution. What did he think? And his reply was, well, he didn't know because it was still too early to tell. Well, these social and political events that focus upon grievance and individual liberty and universal rights of man took place within the context of the gathering industrial revolution. The redistribution of population in the Western countries from agricultural settings to urban ones, and the dramatic growth of cities from across Europe and America, expanding economies, worldwide colonial exploitation, the resources of people, and the emergence of vast capitalist consumer product industries. This painting by Monet presents the mingling of these classes, of the haut monde and the petit bourgeois. Those people here that are in governance and also in the bohemian and avant-garde crowds there's grandmothers and there's authors in this painting. It's a new dynamic, a new social mix you see in the Tuileries, a public park that was fashioned from a former private royal pleasure garden. Realism in art and design emerged in this era as a deep interest in trying to see and understand what the world is and had become, and quickly became ideological and controversial, initiating the situation of a self-proclaimed avant-garde. The reaction of Géricault, Courbet, Daumier, and Millet, the writing of Zola, these two paintings of Monet, his friend, one is of Zola himself and one is of Nana, a prostitute, in one of his novels. The writings of Balzac and Flaubert and others, along with the painting of Monet himself, Pissarro, Degas, Monet, Seurat, and Renoir, as well as the writings of, say, Baudelaire and Proust, seem to us today to be the celebration of both the haut monde and of the bourgeoisie. The shoppers, the gossips, the flaneurs, the cafe society and workers, the entire world of souls who filled the grand magazines that we call department stores, the arcades, the boulevards, the cafes, bars, and parks, they concerned themselves equally with the physical and social world of their day. The literature and painting, especially that labeled Impressionism, was a reaction against sentimentality, fantasy, and romanticism, and it attempted to directly and accurately present life and whatever subject matter came to the artist's attention, something often referred to as the truth. Well, among the very last paintings of Monet are these very close, bold, loose, and powerful observations of flowers that were brought to him by his friends as he was dying. They're a portrayal of a palpable, immediate world. One of the things that his generation witnessed and engaged that, as often as not, was both the setting and the subject, was the new public and civic realm produced by the bureaucracy of the Prefect of the Seine, that of Baron Haussmann and Adolphe Alphand, their grand projets of the boulevards and the parks. The transformation of the urban structure and formal royal enclaves, along with the parks and squares that they created from scratch between 1840 and 1860, produced the Paris that is painted by Monet, as you see here, that we still know. The series of public works recently served as that particular series of public works served as the model for the grand projets of this latter part of the 20th century that are undertaken by Pompidou, d'Estaing, Mitterrand, and Chirac. One obvious motive for the creation of Parc La Villette, or Parc Citron, Parc Bercy, the Jardin Atlantique, and the Parc Diderot, and others was simply to enhance the city of Paris for the benefit of its own citizens and for the nation. But another motive for these parks was they were a device to instruct the large influx of immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, and a host of former colonies about how to socialize and behave in public, how to be a French citizen. This was also an era, the same era, of Frederick Law Olmsted and his remarkable and innovative work here in America. Following upon the thought of Emerson, Thoreau, and others, he was a contemporary of Marx and Engels, of Lincoln and Herzen. Olmsted proposed an urban agenda of reconstruction and infrastructure, bringing aspects of the natural and rural world into the heart of large cities in an attempt to contribute to the betterment and health of the urban poor, as well as the middle class that he represented and from which he'd come. At times in the past decade, his work has been characterized by some of my former students and my peers as being romantic and out of date, pigeonholing him as even dismissing his great works as picturesque and old-fashioned. Well, nevertheless, despite the fact that FLO was framing his views and work in the Victorian era, like that of Monet or Alphand, there are reasons to take it as profound and prescient, regardless of how they may have aged or looked to young Turks today, who have been raised on the internet and very dreamy digital imagery. From 1870 to 1920, critical dispute in literature focused upon the naturalism of Zola. And Proust and others reacted strongly against what they perceived to be the overdetermination of works of their art by content alone, and what was seen as almost total passivity before this raw phenomena. Painting, especially Impressionism, pursued light, color, and issues of the relationship between perception and representation, leading without planning or intent to the radical departures that we know of as Cubism and abstraction and the abandonment or eventually any interest in representation at all. Oops, excuse me, I skipped. Let me just see what happened. Oh, well. In America, the so-called Ashcan school of Sloane, Henri, Glockens, and others carried the early French agenda forward with a heavy dose of social observation and critique. As the Great Depression deepened, artists such as Edward Hopper and Walker Evans shifted the emphasis of their work away from the collective toward the individual into solitude, as did writers as different in style as James Joyce, Eliot, and Robert Frost. Debates about realism continued into the 1930s, but were hijacked and debased by political agendas in America, Europe, and most dramatically Russia, where a form of radical propaganda virtually drove it from the stage of leading design and art, at least in the realm of civic space, while even social critics such as Lukács, Brecht, Adorno, and Benjamin astutely addressed the relationship between forms of production and the results sociologically and politically, if not in a satisfactory manner aesthetically. Well, the world of fine art wandered off, and over the next 50 years went through a series of self-proclaimed avant-gardes, radical shifts of concept, production, and fashion that, regardless of the brilliance and merit of the work, had little effective engagement with the larger issues of the urban realm, the quality of life in cities, or the perplexities of design, whether it be of parks and landscape, emerging ecological crises, or of architecture. This, in part, is due to an obsession with novelty and a fixation with what was only one aspect of early modernism, a desire for transgression to shock and upset the established order, not necessarily a very sound basis for the design of public space, especially if a major purpose is to engender community and health. So now, let me try to explain my interest in this topic of realism. In 1967, the year I made these sketches, I became disenchanted with the design and creation of buildings, no matter how interesting or good, which I had been doing for some time in several of the best architecture offices in both the West and the East Coast. It was a time of questioning for every thoughtful person of my generation, whether it was about society and its behavior or the world, civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, war in the Middle East, the Russian invasion of Central Europe, the Cuban Missile Crisis, generally a society at war between the generations. I retreated first to a cabin at the end of Long Island and then to one on an island in Puget Sound in an effort to refocus upon the world and life. I had studied with the poet Theodore Roethke for several years during and after architecture school, and I was deeply impressed by what we had read, such as Ezra Pound's one-line manifesto of modernism, "Make it new." Well, yes, of course. But what was it we had to figure out? Wallace Stevens' idea, where he said, not the idea about the thing, but the thing itself. What we found in William Carlos Williams and Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman and others all pointed to perception and confrontation with the physical world and its splendor and its ordinariness and minutiae, as well as had been the case with both Emerson and Thoreau. Each in their way demanded that one or society should start afresh from a confrontation with ordinary things and the fundamentals of human existence and community. Well, for several years, I drew a lot and everywhere in an attempt to take up the pleasures and burdens of daily life and nature. I, quote, went into the woods, as Thoreau said, and yet, like him, I came out again to live in a city and study life, in this case, on Skid Road in Seattle, and to re-enter architecture briefly for 3 more years as my friends, teachers, and I battled City Hall and the business community to save the Pike Place market. Well, next, I managed to leave America for several years to live, work, and study, to read, write, and think in Europe, mostly in Italy and England, with doses in France and Germany. What I saw and absorbed confirmed my instincts to develop a focus upon the landscape of cities and their civic realm, their parks, their gardens, squares, piazzas, streets, and boulevards. The accumulated framework and infrastructure of the public spaces of cities, grand and small, which provided the setting for the social interaction that was so fundamental to the health and welfare of their citizens, places that played an important role in the daily life, as well as the spirit, understanding, and the imagination of workers and poets, of artists, business leaders, and politicians. The evolution, form, the elements, the management of civic spaces that I admired fascinated me. Returning to America to teach in the Department of Landscape Architecture that even then was internationally distinguished for its pioneering work in ecological planning and design, almost immediately I became involved in an ambitious transportation civic design study of all places for Washington, D.C., funded by the NEA and DOT. Well, I was with Joe Passano, if anybody's alive in the room that still remembers Joe. He and I worked on this project for a number of years, and among the many proposals we made was one for a light rail system with a portion of it which you can see in the lower, I guess right there on K Street, which now 40 years later, in the previous administration, the one we have now, it was beginning to happen. I don't think it's going to happen under this administration. Well, I was interested to see which of the things I'd absorbed in the European public life could be applied here. I also had come to the conclusion that unless we could make our cities rich and satisfying places to live and get Americans to see a reason to live more densely, we'd never be able to stop the disastrous sprawl of suburban development. We'd never be able to save the rural and agricultural lands near cities that are so important, nor even the more distant forests and wilderness. So I recalled a remarkable essay I'd read in school in 1959 that J.B. Jackson wrote and published in his little yet prescient magazine Landscape, entitled "The Imitation of Nature," that discusses the impossibility of doing so. Excuse me, I need some water. I'll take a glass of water. Going too fast. We'll get through this. Well, he said it was impossible. He wrote, as a man-made environment, every city has 3 functions to fulfill: It must be a just and efficient social institution. It must be biologically wholesome habitat, and it must be a continuously satisfying aesthetic sensory experience. Well, almost immediately upon opening my office with a partner, Bob Hanna, he and I plunged into several significant projects over a brief 5-year period of intense activity, risk, experiment, and optimism. Some might also say naivete. These included the 16th Street Transitway Mall in Denver, you see on the right, the Battery Park City Master Plan in New York, we did with Alex Cooper and his office on the left, and the Fifth Avenue Terrace and the New York Public Library and Bryant Park, you see in the middle, all happened in a very short period of time. It began. We were building an office staff with all of us, we were learning on the job. We also began to gain an understanding of the great difficulties of producing a significant public space in the latter part of the 20th century in the United States. Within the next several years, while these first projects were under construction, we also began work on entire districts and significant public spaces in Europe and America, necessitating further consideration regarding the intersection of purpose, character, elements, and arrangement within particular and different environments and cultures to shape the public realm, ranging from Playa Vista in Los Angeles to Canary Wharf and Bishopsgate in London. Lucien Lefebvre, the French social scientist, has written, "Each society offers its own particular space. In ancient Greece, there was the polis, consisting of the agora, various public stoas, streets, and ways. After the developments that I referred to a moment ago in the 19th century, Western cities incorporated what he refers to as bourgeois space, with their emphasis upon places of exchange and commerce. Well, as everyone in this room knows, much of what we think of as public places today in this country are not really civic spaces at all. Much of our environment is really an expression of economic determinism, subject to privilege, exclusion, surveillance, and commercial management. But according to Lefebvre, genuine social space is made up of an ensemble of visual characteristics. First, there is a matter of accommodating social practices, including necessary performance criteria and standards of competence, to be able to promenade down a street without having to concentrate unduly, to avoid bumping into other people or falling into open basement areas. Second, there's a matter of having a sufficient representativeness to the space in question by the way of signs and other codes so that it is legible, imaginable, and so on. In short, not to mistake a church for a dry cleaner, for example. And third, social practices require representational spaces embodying complex symbolism about, for example, identity, ownership, civic pride, and civic pride. In civic realist terms, this means, and I'm still quoting Lefebvre, in civic realist terms, this means creatively making environments for those practices involving the state and civil society and everyday life, which are either widely regarded or warrant distinction. Well, another key criteria for social space that emerges is the tolerance of real variety of social practices within limits that are well defined by both custom and the physical attributes of the place itself. Over the years, as I worked on these urban projects and thought about them, and I felt they were what was exemplary, and I began to watch how the places we'd been making were working. I also realized that Olmsted had got something rather profoundly right, namely our need for contact with natural phenomena. Considering the increasing urbanization of world culture, questions of human and social well-being and our relationship to nature and its attributes as a matter of health, individual well-being, personal and physical development, and social justice are topics facing all those who plan and design public space in urban situations. The needs of children and the elderly, for example, not a central audience for civic design in the past, largely because their needs were accommodated through a kind of looseness in the settlement fabric, as well as family and social structures, unlike today. Well, their needs are rarely addressed as influential in the design of cities or public space. As the middle class struggles in America and elsewhere today just to maintain the situation it enjoyed in the past century, and other cultures attempt to achieve or deny a successful and open middle class and its amenities, Questions of resource allocation and content, design character and elements pose questions for those involved in planning and design. Our work has from the start taken a clear position on these issues through what I have referred to as the conscious perfection of the ordinary. This stems from an interest and conviction that commonplace and everyday environments, provided they are of sufficient quality, can bring people into contact with the essence of things and thereby provide them with an excitement or deep comfort about the world they inhabit. Moreover, if one's daily routine and spatial experience can be rendered well in ordinary terms, both the meaningfulness and congeniality of public life will be greatly enhanced. Well, instead of being banal or mundane, ordinary spatial and sensory experiences can bring us closer to the world and in a natural relationship to it. At about the same time we were developing much of our early work in the office in Philadelphia, I moved my teaching activity to Harvard. Well, across the street from the GSD in Emerson Hall, it was the home of the philosophy department. There was Hilary Putnam, Stanley Cavell, and Nelson Goodman. They were debating and working their way through what was come to be referred to as ordinary language problems, in part having to do with nagging doubts about our relationship to the existence of the world, or at least our ability to deal with persistent problems of meaning. I found their work inspiring in part because of their interest in our capacity to have meaningful and useful exchange and shared lives. And shared lives. I did find them useful. Through the, shared lives through the employment of ordinary language. My interest in the ordinary was a decidedly quotidian one. I felt that pursuing it in our work provided a useful basis for deciding things that my colleagues felt to be truly undecidable aspects of expressive meaning. There's a lot of talk today about sustainability. Well, this is a topic that landscape architects have been concerned with for centuries. The central premise of sustainability is, or at least should be, that of sustaining health, both mental and physical, as if they could be separated. Well, many since classical antiquity, philosophers, artists, social critics, architects, poets, have posited that urban areas and cities are harsh and unhealthy environments, and that natural and rural areas are healthier and even morally superior. Well, they discount, however, that there are serious problems and issues in rural environments as well. One can behave ethically or unethically, morally or immorally in any environment, especially today. I can personally attest to the fact that rural poverty can at times be even more bestial and hopeless than that of urban areas, certainly for children who often have more options and many more opportunities in cities than their country cousins. Nevertheless, this recurring feeling about cities is based upon something that does have a factual basis. Thoreau, Emerson, and Olmsted all felt the profound attraction to nature and wrote extensively and passionately about the subject, even while attracted to and working within the context of community and rapidly expanding cities. Well, a few years ago, Richard Louv gathered together a worrying and thoughtful amount of information from scientific research, educational studies and reports, critical data, and the writing of thoughtful journals and government agencies in a remarkable book entitled The Last Child in the Woods, in which he makes a case for what he described as nature deficit disorder. In it, he presents the case that contact with nature is essential for the healthy physical and emotional development of children. He doesn't present it as a cure-all for the wave of obesity, attention deficit disorders, depression, anxiety, and the other ills afflicting more and more people, especially the young in developed societies. But the many studies and researchers he surveys make a compelling case for the role that exposure to and familiarity with nature and natural phenomena plays in the care and feeding of our nervous system, our mental development, and our acuity. Well, researchers at Heriot-Watt in Edinburgh University in Scotland have conducted a series of studies to test the ancient assumption that the combination of contact with nature, fresh air, and moderate exercise as a break from urban routine is fundamentally good for people. Many of us have had the ad hoc and personal feeling of well-being or an improved mood after a breath of fresh air or a stroll through a park or on a lunch break or a weekend. But these academics decided to see what basis, if any, there might really be physiologically. Well, as reported in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, they attached no portable EEGs, those electroencephalograms things, to your scalp for a number of healthy young adults, and they sent them out on a predetermined walk through 3 different urban scenes for 1.5 miles. It included a historic shopping district with handsome architecture, numerous pedestrian light traffic. Then there was a park-like setting, and finally a busy commercial district with contemporary architecture of concrete and glass with heavy traffic. Well, the result was what one might expect. The recorded brainwaves showed mental activity in areas associated with frustration, coping with difficulty while in the busy commercial area, and calmer as they moved through the green spaces. And rather than merely exhibiting less signs of stress, the recorded data even showed similar patterns to the mental activity such as those of subjects involved in meditation or quiet concentration. As one researcher remarked about the mental activity observed in the more natural setting, it's called involuntary attention in psychology. It holds our attention while at the same time allowing scope for reflection. In other words, a brief stroll through a park area is more than a mere palliative against urban stress, but also a situation that allows for and encourages mental acuity and activity of a productive and creative time. By the way, all the images I've shown so far, and we'll show through the rest, ever since the paintings, they're all projects of ours, which I don't feel like describing ad nauseum, but it's our work you're looking at. So these women here are walking on the roof of a conference center in Salt Lake City that we did with our friends from the ZGF in Portland. It's a version of what Alexander Pope would refer to as calling the country in. Well, as suggested earlier, designed as a 4-acre alpine meadow that's right in the middle of downtown, across from the Mormon temple. It's more people sit inside that building than in the Utah Jazz facility down the street, which has a asphalt built-up roof with gravel. Anyway, no comment. As suggested earlier, designers, poets, and potentates before Olmsted on numerous occasions proposed the importation of natural landscapes into cities, literally rus in urbs, creating parks that attempted to reproduce aspects of natural scenery in parks, gardens, and estates. And many of these were developed in conjunction with natural features such as streams, rivers, escarpments, and sites that posed difficulty or hazard for development and opportunity for gardens, villas, parks, and recreation. As a result, many historic urban areas have a legacy of great parks that were well loved and heavily used. Unfortunately, as most cities around the world and their economic problems have grown in recent decades, many societies have been unable or unwilling to continue such practices at a scale commensurate with the needs of their population for such beneficial domains, or at least not at the scale of the need. But even on a smaller scale, there are a lot of things one can do. Let's look at Columbus Circle in New York. One aspect of many civic spaces from the past that I've studied and grown fond of, whether in Europe, America, or Asia, is a spirit of generosity, of largesse, a surplus of some kind, whether it's of space or materials or scale, furnishings or delight in some form. Well, Columbus Circle was a space that had been through much iteration before its devolution into the 1980s into a bewildering and dysfunctional intersection. Bob Hanna and I were asked by the Central Park Conservancy to see if we could fix it. And so we did a scheme. There's the above, before, and below, after that we did here. But we were dismissed by Henry Stern and the Parks Commissioner when we tried to straighten out the awkward entry into Central Park that had been created by Robert Moses around the main memorial there. It was a complete mess because we proposed removing some weed trees that obscured Olmsted's spatial composition. So Henry fired us because we were cutting trees. Others later executed some aspects of our scheme adjacent to the park, but it didn't go ahead. Well, my office worked on it again in the mid-90s for a second time as part of an ideas competition sponsored by the Municipal Arts Association, but again, without any result. This time, we were interested in the potential revealing layers of the subway and concourses beneath it, and the possibility of connecting the spaces visually, vertically, with skylights, fountains, and seating that would create a public theater of sorts around the monument to the ancient mariner. Well, when it became a viable project in the late autumn after that didn't happen. So after 9/11, it actually became a project again. When the late Giuliani administration asked us to participate, but at that point, the transit wouldn't let us open up the skylights, and MTA and the streets wouldn't let us pave the streets with continuous carpet of stone. But nevertheless, I was determined to create more than a mere refuge from traffic. And I pushed for an open, attractive space into which one could step out of the city, even while still being in it, to look around, to relax, to meet friends, or merely just to be. And even though it also could function as a shortcut across the intersection. Well, this we have done through the employment of several devices. First, the traffic was reorganized brilliantly by Philippe Habib, a transportation planner and civil engineer, with 3 new, very carefully located signals and pedestrian crossings. Next, we manipulated the topography and created a step berm planted on the outside with fountains on the inside and broad walkways that sliced through it. We also inverted what had existed before. The Columbus Monument used to stand in a tiny basin. It was a miserable puddle, which even in its peculiarly small size kept people away from the monument. The entire ensemble was wide open to the streets and the traffic that swirled about. Well, instead, we created a true island surrounded by water in large and generous fountains that masked the noise of the traffic in the city while providing movement, light, and cooling on hot summer days. I like that it was an island. After all, Columbus discovered a group of islands, not a continent. Conventional wisdom, of course, has it that seating, especially park benches, should have backs to lean against comfortably. Well, here I concluded there was no correct direction in which to sit or to face, and that the vertical presence of the backs of benches would chop up the relatively small space and visually cut off the fountains from the center or visually from across the space, the circle. So we made these enormous, long, curving benches with the cross-section of a wide wooden pillow. And as a result, people came at all hours of the day and night to sit or stretch out in all directions, in groups, couples, and singly, as well as on the rescued steps of the base of the historic monument in the middle. It has literally become a new place in the city, one that never existed before, and is in the middle of a 5-way intersection. And amazingly, people also use it to traverse the intersection, something unheard of. Returning to the mark a few minutes ago, it's also a space that provides a generosity and amplitude of materials, of sensual experience, of scale and spirit, with its fountains, with sunlight, with water, an enclosing circle of buckeye trees and planting, and graceful, ample stone and fulsome benches. Well, you can imagine my absolute pleasure when less than a year after it was completed, the New Yorker magazine used a drawing of it as seen from the windows of Lincoln Center Jazz in the adjacent Time Warner building as a graphic image of the city for one of their festivals. It had already become a recognizable and memorable place that was part of their self-image. It was now on the mental map of New Yorkers as a place, and a pleasurable one at that. Well, this principle of making places particular and not generic is as important as that of making them well. On one of my first projects, way back in 1977, in a public meeting in Denver, I was asked by the head of the Regional Transportation District why I was proposing polychrome granite paved street with trees. Well, I responded that it was a better deal than building such an important street at the heart of a city out of concrete or asphalt. I suggested it was the single most important public space in the heart of the polis, and they couldn't afford to build it cheaply or badly. In my view, it was a place where the citizens could come out and be together, to see and interact with each other in the commercial core of the metropolitan region, and that it needed to be special. I pointed out the relatively short life of concrete and asphalt roadways in the Denver region due to the remarkable freeze-thaw cycles there that are worse than Minneapolis. And I said especially, and so I felt that stone, especially granite, a material produced under intense heat and pressure, was one of the most durable materials on the planet, and we didn't know how long it would last before needing to be replaced, since most of the Appian Way was still in place, except for a portion that had been stolen by the mafia for resale as a durable building material. How could Denver not afford to build seriously in their most public space? So we got the granite. Well, the scheme our office developed to link two blocks of development by Harry Cobb, IMP's partner, was conceptually very simple. It consisted of a pavement conceived as a carpet runner, 12 blocks long, 2 rows of trees, and lights. They were more like floor lamps than street lights. They shone up, down on the pavement and up on the trees. The carpet pattern was largely inspired by several 19th century Navajo trading blankets. Although I will admit, I did notice some rattlesnake skin belts in a tourist shop on the street when I was doing my initial site reconnaissance. And also there was the ghost of the pavement and the Pantheon kind of hanging around somewhere in the back of my mind. So all this stuff kind of goes together. It comes out somehow. These pictures are of 16th Street before and after our project. There were only a few benches and small fountains at the beginning and end of the central portion for some punctuation. I didn't want to do too much else, so as to allow the community to figure out what else they wanted and how they were going to use it. Well, our details weren't perfect, and like most design professionals, as I said earlier, we're learning on the job. Our work has always been an experiment. There have been some necessary repairs and maintenance. However, the net effect has been overwhelmingly positive. Efforts by Downtown Denver, Inc., a business organization, and the Regional Transportation District to make changes ran into very strong opposition from the citizenry, who have declared it a well-loved historic landmark. When I told the public meeting on the topic that I was the original designer and that I had several ideas how to improve it, that possibly to make it better, they said, forget it. The mall was theirs, and they didn't want anyone messing with it. So as these two pictures are taken 30 years apart on that space. This public scheme has helped to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in investment construction and is the most popular and visited site in the downtown. Our notion that a well-built and handsome street of granite with trees, something of a ramblas or a stretched piazza, might work as a sociable space, even in contemporary America, prove successful. Americans didn't need a user's manual to know what to do in this space. The degree to which it became attractive to homeless people and to young teens who seemed frightening to others, with nowhere particular else to go for a time, didn't mean that there was something wrong with the space. It only meant there was something wrong with its surroundings, with the management, with the general society. It wasn't the street. Well, I'm happy to say that today it is managed well, and ordinary middle-class office workers, shoppers, and visitors, plus disadvantaged people, are very happily accommodated. It is a truly civic space, open, democratic, generous, and life-affirming. Decades later, in 2001, I joined a group of other professionals in the city of Portland, Oregon, to study an urban situation they'd puzzled about for several generations, namely what to do in an area facing redevelopment between two distinctly different but important and well-loved sequences of parks to the left and right, which you see in this drawing. Well, we're planning several spaces, and I argued to save some of those buildings. They were quite wonderful, small-scale buildings that you couldn't recreate today, but that we should have good open spaces at the beginning and end of two very nice, small, intimate streets. And the first one, the one that we were asked to then to go ahead and work on, was the one on the left, which you see that little blue rectangle. And that became Director Park. But it was on top of a garage that was already under construction. We didn't have any design, but they were building the garage anyway. So we had to figure out what to do. And we thought about it. And I began thinking about how to implement this space. It should be an urban piazza, I decided, partly in contrast to all the other all the other spaces in the city and region, and partly because it seemed to offer something that I believed would be popular and well used in that particular location, climate, and city. It led to discussions about what would constitute a park today. And despite my earlier remarks, I was not particularly interested in a debate centered around lawn, naturalism, the appropriateness of whether we should have a cafe or not. I'm neither a formula nor a rules kind of guy. I simply felt it would be nice to create a lovely place that looked good even when damp on a gray, drizzly day, where one could sit and socialize, read a paper, have a coffee or a snack, meet a friend, watch people, relax. I was interested in making it welcoming and a good place to be. This meant that it needed to be open and have a variety of comfortable, attractive, and generous places to sit. I also knew that that there are very few special public squares and parks that I know that I really like that don't have water and trees. So Director Park ended up with just that very mix of things. Oops, wrong button. So I began doodling, I began sketching and thinking about it, and I returned to my Pacific Northwest background and my interest in its damp atmosphere and my fascination for constructed or lithic stone surfaces. To some extent, those ideas drove the scheme. Why, I wondered, why didn't people in this rainy Northwest cover their public squares with glass, like the great train sheds and arcades of Europe and America in the 19th century? I'd spent many hours outdoors in winter on a porch when I lived on Bainbridge Island in Puget Sound. You could read, write, draw, paint, eat, be with friends outdoors most of the year if you were undercover. Also, fortunately, water still runs downhill. The site, it's a very small one, it was only 30 by 60 meters with streets on all four sides, sloped considerably from south to north. I proposed a couple of level terraces with a high canopy at a civic scale, a small cafe, some loose tables and chairs, and a fountain at the low end of the site that would gather and hold water that ran down the pavement, and it could spray back up out of the pavement a little bit further uphill. Well, there would also be benches and various furnishings such as chessboards and tables on the pavement and a small space under some trees. And like many of our other projects, the whole thing was built over 5 levels of parking. So there are sizable vent and stair structures that came up in the middle of it also that we had to kind of push around. But despite some concern by others that it needed to be softer with more planting, I argued that Portland was dripping with vegetation, that its citizens lived in the most verdant region of the US, and that wasn't what they needed more of in this particular place. I also argued that for a cafe and for toilets, convinced that it was wrong-headed to build public places without these fundamental amenities, and that one could not depend upon the neighboring businesses that are subject to the vagaries of economic cycles and would not want non-consumers using their facilities, especially those who are on hard times or mothers who just wanted to change diapers for their babies. Well, while arguing for a fountain of some sort, I concluded that it needed to be a rather modest and even maybe a silly one, not grand. This was because just across town is one of the greatest works of 20th century landscape design, Iris Fountain by Larry Halprin. Larry was one of my heroes, and that particular work was an enormous inspiration to me when I was entering the field. I remember saying, with Beethoven down the street, one can't do Beethoven, you have to do something else, something with a lighter touch. I thought that this space, I thought of it as analogous to a small salon in the palace of the city, one for chamber music and intimate gatherings, not grand balls and concerts. So this is a small study model that I had Tiffany Beamer, who is an assistant of mine at the time, is now the CEO of our firm. I had her make a little model for us to play with and to use to talk with our fountain consultants, CMS Collaborative from California. So as with several other projects of mine, the surface was conceived of as a fabric of stone. While it began with the memory of woven baskets, in this case, several by Native Americans who once lived in the Columbia River Basin, it is monochromatic, unlike Denver. In this case, I wanted the pavement to be quiet, to be calm, to elegant. It was a small space with visual interest and richness that would come from texture and pattern. I began exploring various herringbone patterns and block sizes and shapes and textures. Well, the beautiful blonde granite that we found, reminiscent of the pale grass straw and roots of the baskets, is cut into long, thin blocks. Most are bush hammers, but a series of the lines run diagonally through the pavement that are made with blocks that are reeded or that are, tooled with corrugation. The water, the light, and enhance these structures immensely. Just simply the dirt, the water, and the light. Some days from some directions it's sharp and noticeable, and on other days, under different conditions, it's more subtle and even barely noticeable at all. So the monolithic stair treads that feather into the slope are handsomely tooled and modular also with the pavements. As often happens with our projects, the workmen became genuinely intrigued by what we were building. They really got into it, and they did a beautiful job. A further aspect of this new urban place is that we were convinced that we convinced the city government to extend our biscuit-colored pavement from building face to building face in the east-west direction. Vehicles entering the space driving north or south will therefore move into and through the square, sharing the same pavement as the pedestrians. This terrified everybody at first, and we said, no, the stone and its texture is going to cause them to move more slowly than on other blocks. But we did agree, okay, we'll put out a few little warning signs, but basically we carried the pavement because the site was so small, we wanted to go from building to building, like a real piazza. Anyway, we got it done. Such things really do matter, in my view. They matter enormously. Well, for many years, as you are getting the idea, I think, our office has conducted an ongoing set of experiments about public seating. The most famous being that of introducing loose chairs in Bryant Park, as you see on the left here in New York. Now, this is old hat in Europe, but it was a real stretch for New Yorkers 40 years ago. You see it everywhere in America today. In several projects, I explored what was deemed another counterintuitive notion, that of the backless bench mentioned earlier. Most people, me included, believe that public seating should offer comfort, back support, for obvious reasons, and a sense of security. Well, there are, however, numerous instances when backs on benches are undesirable due to contextual issues of sight lines and views and a need to allow people to face in more than one pre-described direction. How to make them then, and how to make them attractive? Well, the first time I did it, I tried it in Wagner Park in Battery Park City, New York. I decided to make them overly generous. This is my first venture at this. And I decided to make them broad and very long, stretch them, theorizing it would be like an attractive thing in and of itself. But it would also allow people to sit in opposing directions without impinging upon one another, or to sit or sprawl or lie around as they chose. It had the profile of a great cushion as well, looked like a pillow, while it was vaguely recalled boat decks or wooden structures or docks or something else. Later evolutions of this at the Washington Monument and in Columbus Circle convinced me that there were other times and other places for this device, as well as the ubiquitous loose tables and chairs and the continuous wall-mounted benches that we also employed and ended up using at Director Park, where we used every one of them. We ended up thinking that this isn't a trivial aspect of sociology of a place. Here, people are free to select and associate with others, or they can maintain their independence in a remarkable variety of ways. That also allows for a truly open and civic space that is used by all manner of people: old people, young people, office workers, the homeless, mothers with prams and teenagers, nearby opera and moviegoers. People of all classes and incomes can be seen here at various times throughout the season. The frequent light rain of the region, falling on this tall civic scale canopy, has led to planted troughs that filter the water before it goes into the drains that form the support for the benches of the terraces, while they also resolve the difference between the sloping street and the level platforms that the tables and chairs are on. And they eventually, of course, recycle the water, which goes down to the next park. Then it is meant to be reused down there after it's been cleaned here. So journalists and landscape architects who are on a design jury were puzzled by this project. I think mostly because it was called a park, but they were mildly friendly, but they were baffled by the fact that it seemed to work. They didn't know what they were looking at. And I thought, isn't that funny? It's called a park and now they're confused. But anyway, something is in a name, I guess, but they didn't seem to notice that it's bounded by trees, which, should they continue to grow for many years until they're quite large and have a significant presence in this very small space. Time is something that they didn't see, but I could see. Time is an aspect of our medium that most people don't see. They don't feel it, but it's part of landscape architecture. The bosque at this small space with the chessboard is composed of yellow woods, which is Cladastris lutea. It's a lovely tree from the Appalachian Mountains of the South, discovered by John Bartram in the 18th century. And it'll surprise people when in the spring, these long pendulous racemes of white blossoms like wisteria hang down more or less heavily every other year. Well, all of the different parts of the park are perfectly ordinary in this case. There's not an unordinary thing in it, but the ensemble is not. This square has been enormously popular, and despite its small size and lack of lawn, attracts a wide variety of diversity of people in all ages, economic strata throughout the day and night. Shortly after it opened in 2012, the park department took counts of users every day through the summer. Between the hours of noon and 7 p.m., there were typically more than 100 people per hour using this small space, tiny space. In August, the average over 2,000 people were counted in the park between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Old people, mothers with prams and children, office workers, shoppers, all find their way to it and hang out. While one must be wary of any quantitative methods in judging quality, you may recall high body counts in the Vietnam War. They were just one of the dramatic proofs that such measurement does not equate with qualitative or other forms of success. Even so, the people of Portland have embraced this new portion of their public realm with enthusiasm. Despite the useful nature of our work, landscape architecture, I do continue to believe that what we do remains very much an art, not a science, and that contrary to popular belief, it is easier to teach science and technology than it is art and humanism. Every place is different, and to try to fit the design of good civic space into some Procrustean bed of urban design rules and formulas is fruitless and wrong. Earlier, I linked the emergence of realism with the emergence of the middle class in modern society, as well as a dramatic development in the creation of civic space for public health and recreation. The economic and political developments that accompany this have delivered the remarkable benefits and great disappointments in the success and failures of democratic governments and materialist consumer society. The worries of Alexis de Tocqueville, of Thoreau, and of Emerson about the competition for control between the individual and the group, the threats to minorities and the tyranny of the majority have continued to play out against a background struggle for self-realization and freedom. The work of our office takes a firm stand on both. The public spaces must be open, accessible, generous, and welcoming to individuals of all sorts, and designed so as not to be dominated by any, essentially encouraging respectful and sociable behavior. This has been one of the great lessons of the rise of the middle class, something envied around the world and particularly fragile and under assault today. These are attitudes, approaches, instincts, and feelings I've tried to share with you that were employed with care and informed with appropriate knowledge, that when they are employed with care and informed with appropriate knowledge and a concern for beauty and the human spirit, as well as an affection for life and society, can make the chances of success quite high. Much of what one does while in the act of working seems to flow from the instinct to be dependent upon the many things one has seen, has done, has learned, and filed away somewhere, often deep down. All of this leads to a recurring paradox with modernity. There's a deep yearning and apparent need for new paradigms that can cope with the scale and character of our urban landscapes on the one hand, and on the other, we have a continuing need for older, timeless relationships and essences, for ancient tropes regarding humans and nature, such as are yoked together in this, our recent design for Pier 26 on the Hudson in Lower Manhattan. One of the hallmarks of nearly all avant-gardes and of youth is a desire to challenge authority in the way things are or have been. Transgression is a default position for those who wish to make their mark in the arts and design as an opening career move. Yet a disruptive public realm is not particularly useful or much benefit to society. Many prominent designs, especially in architecture in recent times in current journals, have little concern for the success of cities and society, or even the many aspects of current understanding of sustainability. Now, please do not mistake this as a conservative argument in disguise or a rearguard attack upon contemporary design. It would be more proper to call me a good old-fashioned modernist of the sort that pursued an overt progressive political agenda. I have purposely distanced myself from postmodernism, new urbanism, landscape urbanism, and the more extreme and self-proclaimed ecologically determinist camps. Years ago, Peter Rowe wrote that underneath our early work at Bryant Park and Battery Park City, there was a use of classic typologies and a slippery use of precedent that directed people toward familiarity, use, and behavior that was as ethically based as it was aesthetic. I'm sure this is true today as it was then. I also know, as hinted earlier, that well-designed cities cannot imitate all of nature, but they can incorporate aspects of it that we find so stimulating and essential. Those aspects that set in play the beautiful shapes and forms, elegant and simple, elaborate and complex, changeable and recurrent, stable and moving, with passages of shade, pools of light, the play of vegetation, changes of surface and level, varying views and perspectives, the splash of water, its echoes and music, the harmony and contrast of colors, and the unpolluted sun. These are all very ordinary things, but making them available for citizens in their daily routine at the heart of our cities is to serve up a dose of reality and its life-affirming nature. So finally, to conclude, well, my interest in the ordinary or common is not to be confused with an anti-intellectual stance or the attacks upon elites or sophistication, such as one encounters all too often in the popular press, or the unfortunate political posturing of numerous individuals and organizations in America today. Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Stanley Cavell, instead, relate an interest in ordinariness to attitudes one finds in many adjacent poets, many ancient poets and thinkers in Asia, and particularly to an attitude expressed by Emerson and Thoreau. This is an eschewing of derivative secondhand stimulus and a desire to partake of existence and life directly, not from a phone or the internet. As Cavell puts it, an intimacy with existence and a natural relation to existence is what Thoreau means by our being next to the laws of nature, by our neighboring the world. I'm quoting Cavell here. By our being beside ourselves. Emerson's idea of the near is one of the inflections he gives the common, the low. Cavell goes on to say that the recurrent appeal to ordinary language in the history of philosophy from the time of Socrates through the Enlightenment and modernity is a sign that there is some inner wish of philosophy to escape as well as to recover the natural. Emerson's embracing the common is not a repudiation of culture or science and the advancement of art and intellect. He does, however, specifically state his preference not for the great, the remote, the romantic, but for what has been described as a continued search for a new intimacy in the self's relationship to the world. His stated goal in The American Scholar, a famous lecture of his, is to call upon his fellow citizens to turn away from limitations in foreign styles and derivative thought, and to discover or rediscover the world within themselves and the world around them. This was not a jingoistic, nationalistic, or ethnocentric call to arms, but rather a directive that asked us, Thoreau does in Walden, for us to create a life, art, and nation that is fresh, authentic, and whole. In a word, as natural as nature when we draw near to it and take it in with both understanding and passion. So my invocation of the middle class or of children as the consciously intended recipients of my efforts in the design of civic space and landscape is not to miss the irony of their usual and general obliviousness to their situation or the topics of my concerns. The suspicion, anger, and attacks upon the middle class, vilified as the bourgeoisie or petite or haute bourgeoisie on the part of numerous intellectuals and artists through the last 2 centuries, that continues today was or is, while apparently directed toward generations of those who have labored through misery, hard work, tedium, deadening decades in industry, commerce, and homes, who have suffered and struggled to make a decent life for themselves and their families. That criticism has really been intended toward the hypocrisy and petty concerns and ambitions, self-deception, waste, pretension, and thoughtless expense, competition, and escapism, along with the lies and manipulation of leaders and politicians who have used and abused them on every continent. The critiques of both capitalism and collectivism are many and are often correct and well-founded. But as a landscape architect and an artist, it is my firm belief, however, that is neither romanticism nor pandering to attempt to create rewarding public environments that are accessible to all, rich, poor, young, old, able, disadvantaged, especially for the many who work and strive and are buffeted by the forces of society and life that are manipulated by commerce and politics. That is not a sop or a mere palliative to attempt to create places that allow them to come in touch with natural phenomenon directly, with themselves and their senses and sensibilities, and with their fellow citizens and the larger community. For me, this seems a direct response to the problem of realism and to both Ezra Pound's directive of make it new and to Emerson and Thoreau's challenge that we draw near to the world, to nature and ourselves while in the heart of our cities, great and small. Thank you very much. I probably was a little longer than you hoped for, but I'm happy to take questions, and I am used to students walking out on me and other people going to take care of their dogs and their babysitters. So anybody who has to leave, go ahead, just do it quietly, and I'll answer questions for a few minutes. Go ahead, please. Don't be shy. I'm.
Hello, thank you for that incredible talk. You give me food for thought for like the next 5 years. This is fantastic. So you made a convincing case, and the diversity of your work, I think, backs up your case that there's no one way to design a great plaza. There's not a formula, something that Jane Jacobs also argued. Yeah, yeah. But are there things you should you can reliably avoid? Are there things that people regularly get wrong, or that you have perhaps gotten wrong, that you can now see as something that students should be alerted to as potential tripwires?
Not sure there was a question. What was the question? You were saying nice things about me, but I didn't know what the question was.
You've argued that there's no set of tools that you can use to get it right every time. Are there any tools you should never use? Are there any problems?
Yeah, well, okay. I don't know if you could tell, but I am devoted to the tool of drawing by hand. I think we haven't a better instrument yet than a pen or a pencil in terms, it doesn't take electricity. You can use it at 30,000 feet in an airplane. It's completely flexible. You put it in your pocket. I have one in my pocket right now. And I am convinced if you can't draw it, you don't know what it is. You don't have an idea. If the interesting thing is, we think of ourselves as builders, architects and landscape architects, but we actually don't make it with our own hands. Somebody else does. And the way they make it is from instructions we give them that are drawings. What we actually do is make drawings. And believe it or not, that's what we make. Other people make things from our drawings. And so one tool is that. Another tool, of course, is travel, look at things, see things, study them, get out of the studio, get out of the building, go into the world, spend some time looking at things, and then read a lot. I have trouble sometimes trying to make my students go to the library, so I have all kinds of tricks to make them do that. But there's a lot of people thought about the same things that you think you're struggling with for many centuries, and it's kind of helpful to read some of that stuff. So I would say tools. What are the tools? Well, learn to build well, learn about materiality. We make drawings, but the drawings are about building things, and things are made of real stuff. And people who don't understand it, I mean, you drive down the road and you see buildings that are clearly designed on a computer. They don't know how to turn a corner. It's just, you can see there's no thickness there. It's one line thick. So you can see buildings that are done on a computer. You also realize that people are using materials like it's all cardboard. It's all, they don't have a sense of the depth and thickness of the textures of the materials. So as architects, you must fall in love with the world and with the stuff, and with the people, because that would be my instructions. Yeah. I don't know. It seems kind of simple, right? But it's a lot of work. Also a certain amount of humility in the business of watching and learning from other people and listening to people and just watching us see. In Denver, what I did was when I first went out there, I didn't know what to do. So I went at lunchtime and I watched people come out of buildings and I'd follow them to see where they went for lunch and what they did. And I just followed people around to see how they were using the downtown. And I thought, oh, this is pathetic. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. There's no there. And so, watching people, they'll teach you a lot, and you also, all the students in this room are probably every one of them is over the age of 20 and, they're stuffed full of information. They've got all this information in their head. It's just how to pull it out in some orderly way and use it. That's part of the trick. Okay, next. Is there another question, please? There's one up here. Yes.
Thanks. When you were talking about Lefebvre and you said something that really caught my attention, and that is that kids and the elderly had tended to be accommodated by a looseness in the settlement fabric.
Yeah.
And later you talked about your deliberate design of spaces for those populations.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that through an approach to looseness in your own work, or were those two different sort of trains of thought?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Two or three answers to that. One is that I find designers tend to design for themselves. And so if I go to a student review, usually there's young people with skateboards and all kinds of stuff like that in the presentations. If I have students from another country, the people quite often look like the people from the other country. We tend to design for ourselves, and because most of us are not we're just no longer children, and most of us aren't elderly yet. I mean, I'm pushing it, but still, the thing is that most designers don't think about them. They think about their client, who's this 50-year-old guy, It used to be. Now there's some 50-year-old women, but still, it's people who are in the middle of their earning years and they're designing for them and their employees. And shoppers. That tends to be what most of the design is done for. And people forget about the family. They forget about the children. They forget about their grandparents. They forget all who make up a large part of the population and would make up a large successful part of our cities if they were designed for them. So I concluded about, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago that if a public space worked for a child, it would probably work for everybody else. That if it was safe enough for a child, it's probably safe for everybody else. But also, if it intrigued them and there was something they could fiddle with, and that it had some sensual pleasures, because children are very directly wired for sensual pleasure, that it probably would work for adults too. And that, and so focusing on the middle class, I felt, well, if you design something well for the middle class, that people who are richer can sure use it if they, oh, hey, I take advantage of what they've done for these other people. And the poor people the disadvantaged, who no one thinks about, they could use it too, because they would like to have some of the same stuff. So aiming at those groups, I thought, would produce a public realm that would really address the society. The remark about looseness I said that in the past, because of the way cities, I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and so, it was very loose. You just went outdoors and there's the woods in the town and you wandered around, and there's a lot, so it didn't need a lot of structure. So kids were okay, and the adults, as long as they didn't run into bears, were fine. But the thing is that in cities, we used to have extended families where people were living with their different parts of their uncles and their aunts, and someone would look after the kids and take them out and do stuff and all that. But that all kind of went away with this kind of atomized families that we now have. And with the notion that why aren't women treated as well as men, and why can't they work, and why can't they have a life, and why can't they do it? So now, so what happens is that children and elderly have real problems and are institutionalized. When I was a child, children throughout America could walk to school, and it was a neighborhood school. You just opened the door and they went to school. In the 1950s, what happened was there was this thing that happened of centralizing schools for efficient. There was this idea that we will make education efficient. It's part of that Eisenhower era where everybody got cars, everybody got single family houses, and we got efficiency. And we were measuring things by efficiency. And so instead of having all these little silly little schools in all the neighborhoods. Why don't they put them all together and have a big efficient school? And then that meant most of the kids couldn't walk to school. They had to be bused or somebody take them there. Once they're there, they couldn't go out and just go across the street and have lunch, or they, so they either bringing a sandwich or they're having to buy something in a cafeteria. We institutionalized all the children in America in the 1950s with our school systems. I mean, that's a fact, right? Busing everybody around, consolidating schools everywhere. We did this. We now have been doing the same thing with adults as they grow older and age out of the working force and become infirm or have health problems. So institutions now take care of things that families always took care of in the past in a much more gentle, sometimes not so nice way. I mean, when there are all the terrible novels about Ireland and everything, and we all know about, all the kinds of abuse that took place in homes of disadvantage and still take place. But my remark was directed at the notion that we have basically the mom and pop stores are gone. The local dry cleaners is just about gone. The local groceries are gone. The local schools are gone. Everything has been institutionalized and made bigger and grander and less human. Just think about it. So my campaign has been to sort of break everything back down, try and get people out of their cars, try and get them into the public space, trying to give them fresh air, water, life, oxygen, and all that, and do what I can with the public space. And so creating systems of public space, which is Olmsted's idea in Buffalo, right after the Civil War. The first set of interlinked public spaces in North America with parks and boulevards and everything. The notion of an interrelated set of linked spaces where nobody was more than 5 or 10 minutes away from a playground or a school or a park is a standard that the World Health Organization still is arguing for. Okay. One more question. Everybody's very patient, but still, anything else is burning thoughts? Hi. You'll have to speak up. I'm quite getting a little hard of hearing. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. You mentioned art and humanity as something difficult to teach, and what came up for me was, what would you think about bringing back environmental psychology as one little way to help design schools have kids be more aware
Right.
of how we affect
I think
humans.
it'd be a great idea. One of the issues you bring up is how do we induce social awareness and sophistication among designers? And are there other fields that can help us, like cultural anthropology, ethnology, clinical psychology, sociology? And the answer is probably yes. When I first joined the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, we had research funds from the National Institute of Mental Health that let us hire 3 anthropologists on our faculty. Now, that was great, but when the money ran out, of course, we lost our anthropologists. But as long as so we had them in the studio, we had them doing lectures, and our students learned a hell of a lot about society and the traditions of community and how things work. And it wasn't just Trobriand Islanders, they were dealing with, people in America. But when my last year in architecture school, I wondered upon Jane Jacobs was publishing parts of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and the first 2 portions of it were in Fortune magazine, of all things, published by the Time Life, that Henry Luce's organization in New York. So it was very interesting that Fortune magazine, which is kind of like the big, corporate publication of America in those days, was publishing Jane Jacobs. And I read them as a last year, 5th year architecture student. I was totally electrified by them. I thought, that's it, right? She's got it. And then I discovered people in Britain who had been working on similar stuff. And so I became very interested in the city. And I realized that the city is, there's rural landscapes, there's primeval landscapes, there's agricultural landscapes, there's suburban landscapes, but there's urban landscapes. And that the city is, someone asked the sociologist, was the French sociologist, the guy who wrote Triste Topics, his name will come to me. Anyway, he said, the city is not an architectural problem. It's a landscape problem. He just said it's not an architectural problem. It's something bigger than that. It's something much more complex. And cities, for me, I see them as being like forests that are very dynamic, and they're coming and going, and there's this resource recycling of nutrients, this competition for resources, things rising, things falling, people competing, and you know, for sunlight, for, you know, privilege, for everything, and that they're in constant change, the churning that goes on in our urban environments that we don't see because it's very incremental. But you look at a picture from 10 years ago and you think, gee, this didn't look like this 10 years ago. And also you're not the same, you know, because they're constantly changing. And cities are extremely dynamic, and they exist in time as well as in our psyches, you know. All right, well, I think you should all go have a nice meal, have a drink, do something, okay? But be social.